good morning and happy Sabbath. Welcome to our online service for Hamilton Central Church. We are blessed to have you with us this morning. We're carrying on our series Blooming in the Boom of Babylon, where we are studying through the book of Daniel. And this morning we are blessed to have Fletcher with us. And he will be looking at Daniel chapter 8, a very, very interesting chapter and one that I'm sure you will be blessed by this morning. But before I let you go this morning, I just wanted to share something with you. In the next couple of weeks, you should be seeing one of these coming to you in your mailbox. If you are a member of Hamilton Central Church or you're on our friendship list, then you'll be receiving one of these in your letterbox, and it is a QR code. I know I don't have to explain to you what a QR code is because you've been scanning them for I don't know how long now, but you're very familiar with them. Basically what this is you're going to scan this and it's going to direct you to our website, our homepage on our website, and we're going to keep our homepage updated with everything that is going on with Hamilton Central Church. Obviously, as we move between levels and these kinds of things, we'll let you know exactly the status of the church, what's happening, whether we're online or whether we're able to meet physically down here, and we're praying that we can do that one day. So that'll come out to you. There'll also be information around our Sabbath schools as well as fellowship opportunities, these kinds of things. So yeah, just something that's going to be really simple to keep in touch with in regards to what is going on with Hamilton Central. And it's good to have simple things when we're living in such complicated times, right? So yeah, keep an eye out for that. If you don't receive one, get in touch with myself or Alicia, and we can make sure that we send one out to you. So may you just be blessed by the service this morning, and we'll see you next time.
Matthew chapter 22, verse 34 to 40. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment, and the second is just like it. Love your neighbour as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments."
Good morning, church family, and happy Sabbath. Please join with me now as I open with a word of prayer. Dear Lord, I want to thank you for all the blessings that you have given us this week. I know that we've been through some challenging times at the moment, but I know that there is many blessings that you give us. So I pray, Lord, that you'll help us to hold on to those blessings as we go through these trying times. I especially want to pray for our church leaders, and especially the ones in our greater conference. There's going to be some hard decisions and things that are going to come up that they're going to be needing to work through. So I pray, Lord, that we continue to pray and uplift them to make the right decision for us as a congregation. I want to thank you for our schools at the moment. Thank you for our amazing teachers who are maneuvering through this online learning, Lord. I pray, Lord, that you'll be with these students who are trying to their best at home with their parents to learn and take in their knowledge that they need to take in. I especially want to pray for our young people who are sitting exams at the moment. These aren't the most ideal times and situations to be sitting final exams, Lord, so I pray, Lord, that you'll take away any anxieties and any stress that they may have during these times and give them the knowledge and the information that they need to know to pass their exams. I want to continue to pray for our church congregation in these hard times as we mourn the loss of our dear friend Lionel. I especially want to pray for his family in this time also. But thank you that we live in the hope and understand that we will see him once again in the clouds as we go to heaven in the clouds to see you one day. I want to pray, Lord, now for our message that we're just about to hear. Thank you for inspiring these words that Fletcher is going to be sharing with us. I pray, Lord, that anybody who is listening today will be inspired and will be encouraged by the words that he is going to share. I want to thank you once again for everything that you've done for us, and bless us as we come into a new week. Amen.
Welcome back to our study of the book of Daniel. Last week, Jeremy moved through chapter 10 of Daniel, but had previously left us all a bit hanging at the end of chapter 7. Remember, he left us with Daniel being troubled by the vision of the lion, the bear, the leopard, and the terrible beast with iron teeth. Because in verse 25 of chapter 7, the little horn has begun to speak pompous words against the Most High, persecute the saints of the Most High, and change times and laws. And the saints were given into his hands for 1260 years. That is a time, times, and half a time, or 3.5 prophetic years, 1260 years in real time. I'd like you to have your Bibles open to Daniel chapter 8, because I will read from time to time and paraphrase from that chapter today as we try and clear up what's happening, when it's happening, why it's happening, and what it means for us today. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts troubled me greatly, and my countenance changed. But I kept this matter in my heart and mind. Several times in the book, Daniel lies sick for days and is troubled. He faints with anxiety or stress. It seems every time he has a vision, he despairs about how God is going to rescue his people, the persecuted saints, or return them to Jerusalem and their temple, restore the daily sacrifices and cleanse the sanctuary, or protect the glorious land, reclaim the kingdoms and dominions, and restore God's promised land. Daniel was tempted to think these visions were all about his Jewish nation, his friends and their family. He was looking forward to returning with the Jews to Israel. Was the 70 years almost up? When would he get his liberty and the right to return and worship at the temple? In the light of the restrictions to his life and freedoms, how did Daniel react? How did he live in his community? Daniel and his friends had taken stands about worship in the past. It had got Daniel thrown into the lion's den and the others into a furnace on the plain of Dura. Both times the issue had been about forced worship and forced behaviour in false worship. These are the times that Daniel had resisted the local authorities and been prepared to lose his freedom or even his life as a result. Yes, he had taken a stand on diet and kept his body pure and healthy, and that had been part of his allegiance to his God. But he and many other prophets and martyrs over the centuries have been prepared to sacrifice that body and health and safety for the sake of the gospel. While our bodies and our rights are precious to us, there is something more important: our willingness to sacrifice so the gospel can be shared in our communities. I'd just like to put my personal perspective to you to consider, not as the right thing for you, but as my way of looking at our current situation. As a young man, I grew up in a family of missionaries. My grandparents served in China, in parts of Asia and the Solomon Islands. My uncles, cousins, and one of my brothers in Papua New Guinea for many years. My parents and another brother in Africa. I myself have worked and lived in more than 15 different countries over the last 30 years. I think I've had almost every jab and vaccine known to man, because that's what I needed, to be free to travel to places where both I and my family served. I carried a vaccine passport for years, and it was needed almost as much as my normal passport in some places. I've added new vaccines, and I've got sick, dangerously ill, in some places where I worked. I think my blood is a veritable United Nations of antibodies. And for years, I've worked with large-scale public health programs designed to save lives and reduce preventable deaths and morbidity. My rationale has always been that if we don't care for the lives of the vulnerable and those at risk, how can we share the story of God's love and compassion for them if we don't model it ourselves? And to be there and to do that, I have to give up some of my preferences and my personal freedoms. Greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for his friend. So for me personally, while I haven't had to do that, I've always chosen to remain part of society, mixing and mingling, travelling and associating with as many people as possible in order to share the love of Jesus and tell the story of his saving grace and plan of redemption. And if that comes at a cost to my health or personal freedoms or my life even, what a small sacrifice that will be in the bigger scheme of things. In the light of the freedoms to worship, that requires a little more scriptural direction and wisdom. And our study of Daniel is truly inspirational in that area. Daniel is given a picture of the events of world history that happen in a fallen, sinful world. The decay in morality, ethics, justice, compassion, fairness, and human rights is evident to anyone who's studied history or even stepped outside of your front door this week. If you, like I have, stood in the open, windswept, bleak fields of Auschwitz, or visited the Holocaust Museum in Washington or the Pol Pot Museum in Cambodia, you'll know a little of the depths of human depravity, hate, viciousness, often against people who are different, marginalised, segregated, or outcast. This really is a natural result of the breaking down of a spiritual connection to a Creator God, a God of love. And it will only continue to change the society in which we live, as we are seeing right now. Discrimination and segregation, mandates and legislation to divide people into two groups on health or social safety issues. This is part of what I would relate to Matthew 24 rather than Revelation 13. These may be a precursor to later events that build up on the back of these experiences by governments, but they are not the main event. You may remember when Christ was asked about the time of the end, what is the sign, they asked. His description was more about the natural breakdown of society, morality, severe weather events, wars and rumours of wars. But this wasn't the sign of the end, he said. The events of Matthew 24 are not the real issue. Jesus said so at the beginning of verse 6. And you will hear of wars and rumours of wars in diverse places. See that you are not troubled, for all of these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Nations will rise and fall, kingdoms will disappear, famines and earthquakes and pestilences will come and go, even mandates will be made. Many will be offended. There'll be betrayal and hatred and lawlessness, as outlined in verses 7 to 12 of Matthew 24. But the end doesn't come because of these events. They're not the real issue. They're consequences of a failing social morality and the natural results of a breakdown of a society that has abandoned God and his truth. And we will get caught up in the turmoil. But the turmoil itself is not the sign. It's not the mark. It's not the seal of God. It's only when the gospel is preached and lived as a witness to all the world that the end can then come. Verse 14. Revelation 13, however, links to today's study in Daniel 8 because it identifies the real issue for which we must take a stand. Revelation 13, 8, 15 and 16 identify the issue where life or death stands must be taken. It's only when I'm forced to abandon my worship of the true God, or am forced to kneel and bow to a beast or his image, like Daniel's three friends, that I must have the loyalty, faithfulness and courage to stand. That challenge is not the same as finding a different venue to worship or limiting the numbers for social distancing or even having a vaccine passport. These events may precede the final mandate and feed into how society responds, maybe by conditioning people, by creating segregation and discrimination on other grounds. But these current restrictions and mandates, passports or QR codes, are not the real issue that defines our allegiance to God. What made Daniel and his friends offer their very lives was when they were offered no choice but to bow, worship, and exalt a false god or image or day, or to deny the true God, the Creator God, who made us in 6 days and then rested to celebrate his creation. Daniel is an old man of about 70 by now, and he's been sick for several years, since his last vision. And that previous vision, some 2 years earlier in the first year of the reign of Belshazzar, had left him distressed and on edge. There was a lingering question that had been on his mind for the past 2 years. Daniel's vision in chapter 7 had not resolved the question of time. How long will it be? How much time must pass before the saints are spared? How much can they bear? And when will it all end? An answer is given: 1,260 years of turmoil, persecution, of trouble and oppression had been measured out for the fourth beast and the little horn to wage war against the saints. And Daniel finds it hard to imagine how any of God's people could survive such a long and sustained onslaught of their faith, their beliefs, their worship. How could this possibly end well for God or his chosen people? And where is God in all of this chaos? Daniel knew of the 40 years that Israel had wandered in the desert, and he'd lived through 70 years of exile from Jerusalem. He'd seen how people lost their way, abandoned their faith, ended in mixed up families with mixed up religions and mixed up cultures, foreign gods. How could God's truth and his chosen people survive 1,260 years of persecution and abandonment and still remain faithful? So we can expect that the vision in Daniel will address some of those questions, or at least give him a heads up on what it's all about, who to obey, how to act, what to do, and what loyalties he should have. But instead, we find the vision ignores Daniel's need to know and talks about God's agenda instead, revealing truth for the time of the end. The empires in chapter 8 have already been identified and described in detail in previous visions and dreams, and in the chart on the screen you can see how the visions are repeated, but with different symbols and detail, sometimes zooming in on specific areas, sometimes adding detail, but always climaxing at the time of the end, where God really wants us to focus. The location of this dream moves from Babylon and begins by the river in Shushan, surrounded by the wealth and prosperity of the Babylonian kings, and in contrast to his previous visions, what he sees now is different from what he saw before. The linguistic style changes from Aramaic to a Hebrew structure. The animals change from beasts of prey to domestic animals, and it's as if the artist's brush moves quickly over some areas and then lingers on others, as if to draw our focus to something new and important. Let's set the scene for you. The city of Shushan is about 380 kilometres east of Babylon on the banks of the Karkeh River, and it's ringed by the Zagros mountain range. It was a nice part of the world to live, I'm sure, and was a favoured city of the kings of Medo-Persia. Darius would later build his palace there along with the treasury buildings, and the city was renowned for its silver and gold reserves. Surrounded by fields of wheat, groves of olives, closer to the Persian Gulf. And Shushan is only a few hundred kilometres from where I travelled while driving through Iran a number of years ago. My Norwegian friend, Pastor Cora Lund, and his son and I were driving overland from Pakistan to Norway in an old 1942 Willys Army Jeep. And the section from the Pakistani border across the salt deserts of Iran runs parallel to the road from Babylon to Shushan, just a little further north. It was an interesting coincidence that Cora's son was called Alexander. And so we all travelled the same route as Alexander the Great, with Alexander the Younger. Countryside didn't look all that prosperous from the jeep, just harvested fields of wheat stubble and olive groves and the occasional truck stop, quite a few military checkpoints, and plenty of graffitied walls saying "Death to America" or "America the Great Satan." It seems that this whole area has experienced war and turmoil ever since the earliest times, and still does today. As Daniel looks across the river from Shushan, he sees a two-horned ram on the banks of the river, and this ram pushes towards the west, the north, and the south. East of Shushan, further towards the Indian continent, was where the Persian Empire was located in what we now call Iran. Verse 4 says, "And I saw the ram pushing westward, northward and southward, so that no animal could withstand him. And there wasn't any who could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great." The unbalanced horns of the ram reflect the uneven alliance between the Medes and the Persians. History confirms that the first attack on Babylon came from Darius the Mede in 551 BC. But within 4 years, Cyrus, the leader of the Persian mercenaries who had fought in the wars against Babylon, had defeated the Medes and, as the bigger horn that grew up later, stepped into power in 539 BC and established the Persian dynasty that lasted for almost 200 years. Now, both Darius and Cyrus preferred the riverside city of Shushan and made this their main treasury city of the empire. With all the accumulated wealth of Babylon and Persia, it became a symbol of their power, but also a huge temptation for surrounding armies as a reason for war. The gold and silver looted by Alexander the Great was in the order of more than $1.4 trillion in today's currency. So it's little wonder that Daniel sees another beast bursting onto the scene and attacking the ram by the river. So now we introduce the second figure in today's drama. 2 centuries on from Daniel's dreaming by the river, a young Alexander emerges onto the scene. There's no negotiation or delay. He wants action, and he wants it now. And already Alexander has left his homeland, marched his troops across parts of Europe, half of Asia and the Middle East in his bid for power, glory and wealth. The ambitious 25-year-old, soon to be known as Alexander the Great, would change the global landscape and introduce Greek culture and philosophy to much of the civilized world for centuries to come. With his highly trained and skilled Macedonian troops, he would be almost unstoppable. But Daniel has already seen this in his vision more than 2 centuries before. He sees this he-goat coming out from the west, moving at such a speed that its feet hardly seem to touch the ground. Verse 5, "And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west, across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes." The strong and single horn of the goat breaks the 2 horns of the ram and deals a fatal blow to that animal. No one seems to be able to stop the savage onslaught. In 490 BC, the Athenians defeated the Persians in the Battle of Marathon. And while it weakened the empire, it didn't conquer it. However, what it did was to allow the Athenians to slowly build their strength on the western borders, so that by 331 BC, almost 150 years later, Alexander the Great would sweep through Babylon and Shushan, taking with him the wealth and the riches of the Persian Empire. He moved on from there, and the road from Iran to India has 2 routes. The northern road leads up through Afghanistan into Kabul, and east again through the Khyber Pass into modern-day Pakistan. The southern route goes through the salt deserts into the Sindh district of Pakistan, then turns north along the Indus River to join the Grand Trunk route into India. Alexander took the northern route as he swept across towards India, taking his army through the Khyber Pass and into the city of Taxila, which is just out of the modern-day capital of Pakistan called Islamabad. I've driven past many times along the same road from Islamabad to Peshawar, near the Khyber Pass, and have stopped on a number of occasions to explore the recent excavations of the hilltop site of the great stupa of Taxila. It's a Buddhist monument from about 600 BC and later became a monastery for training priests. And you can see the little accommodation cells there for the priests. It dates back almost 300 years before Alexander arrived. And from there, if you look, you can see the Grand Trunk route, the road that goes past. And you can imagine the scene as Alexander marches his troops through and receives the surrender of Taxila from the local king in 327 BC. From there, Alexander headed south along the Indus River towards Multan and into his hardest campaign. A local king there defeated him twice using war elephants, but in the third battle, Alexander captured King Porus along with almost 9,000 prisoners and 80 war elephants. Today, if you drive south along the Indus River from Taxila, you'll come to the Muzaffargarh district in Pakistan. And this is where the Chenab River and the Indus River combine. It's also where I worked for some time in the main city of Multan. This was our base for the ADRA relief projects after the Indus River floods in 2010. I spent a good few months there in the city and the surrounding areas. So almost every day, I would drive the main road through Multan, past the ancient site of where the Kona fort was first built in about 580 BC. It's obviously been destroyed and rebuilt many times, but there are still a lot of ancient sites commemorating the history of Multan. Alexander attacked the Multan citadel here during his move south, and he was seriously wounded and almost died. So the campaign slowed a little and he got no further east than that. By now the men were beginning to get homesick and restless, and sickness, battle fatigue, the long marches, the heavy losses of his Macedonian troops meant that his remaining Greek soldiers wanted to return home. So taking the southern route, Alexander marched his troops through the salt deserts of southern Iran, a trip that my Norwegian friend and I would follow almost 2,300 years later. You wind through the sandy desert roads for miles, and the heat is often over 48 degrees. You can easily dehydrate, and because our Jeep was open-sided with just a canvas top, we had to put up with a lot of hot, dry wind in our face all day as we travelled. And it would have been much the same for Alexander and his troops as they made their way home. Within a year, Alexander lay wasting away with fever in Babylon, his dreams and ambitions slipping away. And within a few short years of his death, the 4 generals commanding his army had divided his empire between them. The horn was broken, and history moved on, just as Daniel's vision predicted. We come now to the part of chapter 8 that moves away from geopolitical empires and into the realm of spiritual activities and events. The reputation of a prophet like Daniel and John is usually linked to one key issue: the accuracy of the predictions that have been proven over time as the predictions come true. Once that credibility has been established, the remaining message yet to come can be trusted. It may be some remaining events predicted are clear and easy to recognise, but haven't happened yet. But it may also be that some events are less obvious or obscure and harder to predict, and perhaps are more obvious in retrospect. Or maybe the events are more spiritual in nature, more about what God is doing rather than what man is doing. And this is where we find the real message in Daniel 8. The political history is really only a framework to support the main point. What is God doing to reclaim his truth and to restore his sanctuary and redeem his people? We've seen how Daniel's dreams build on each other, overlapping and expanding in certain detail. Daniel chapter 2, 7, 8, 9 and 11 each prophecy moving forward in time, bringing fresh detail, but covering the same flow of events right through the time of the end. And chapter 8 moves quickly from the two domestic animals to the horns and the winds that cover the period of Rome and the 10 horns, and the feet of iron and clay. In quick succession, Daniel moves across the Roman Empire's time and into the little horn already mentioned in Daniel 7. This horn attacks the glorious land, exalts himself as high as the priest of the host, opposes the daily sacrifice, tramples truth to the ground. And it's clear that Daniel is now talking about a religious power, not a political or government one. Daniel now moves using an Aramaic structure in his writing to a Hebrew structure. The animals become those associated with the Jewish Day of Atonement. The ram and the goat both feature in the ceremonies that are so familiar to Jewish readers. And the idea of the daily sacrifice being taken away, the sanctuary being cast down, the transgression of desolation continuing to the time of the end, all of this is the language of religious issues. It's about worship, it's about truth, it's about sacrifices, it's about redemption. And so the attack is now against those things, against truth, against God's people, against the sanctuary. So Daniel wants to know, how long does the trampling of truth, the sacrifices and the sanctuary last? When do God's people recover their spiritual freedoms and their ability to worship in their temple and return to their celebrations of the Day of Atonement? Isn't this what we want to know today? When do we get our freedoms back? When do we get to open the church again and worship together corporately? Have the government mandates about restrictions for worship crossed the line that God has drawn for us? Is this really about forced allegiance to a false system of worship? Or can we still worship in spirit and in truth, just in a different format or a different place? A well-known song comes to mind. By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down, there we wept when we remembered Zion. Daniel wants to know how things will end too. When will the sanctuary services be restored? If any of you have ever lived in a different religious culture, you will understand what it was like for Daniel. At the Adventist Seminary in Pakistan, we were surrounded by about 20 mosques, all built on the perimeter wall of the campus, and all equipped with loudspeakers and sound systems. So the sound of the mullah's call to worship rang out in every direction, 5 times a day, early morning through to late at night. The sights at the time of Eid and Ramadan, the smells of sacrificed animals, the colours, the festivals, the temples, the mosques, sacrificial altars, everything was foreign to our Western Christian culture. But people still worshipped God in ways that reflected their faith and belief. And maybe we could adapt and change to adjust with these non-religious mandates and the rules that are being introduced to try and deal with a public health issue. And maybe that will encourage us to decide what really is the real issue of worship. Is it about cultural practices? Is it about being alone or in small groups or in large gatherings? Is it place or location? Or is it spirit and truth? We're not facing a new challenge by any means. Millions of people over time have faced similar restrictions for multiple reasons and still found ways to honour God in worship without antagonising local society or government regulations. So the vision in Daniel 8 concerns the cleansing of the sanctuary. What is significant about this event in Jewish worship? You see, for the Jews, Yom Kippur is a significant day, a special day, a day of celebration as well as one of judgment, one that holds special meaning for the chapter 8 of Daniel that we're studying. Jewish rabbis would say, you may choose to forget God for the whole year, commit crimes and ignore religion, but even the greatest villain, if he is Jewish, will repent on the day of Yom Kippur and tremble at the sound of the shofar. Jews would have 10 days before Yom Kippur as a time of preparation for judgment. And the traditional greeting during that time would be, Hatimatova, or may you be well sealed. I guess it was alluding to the divine judgment that determines an individual's destiny and then seals it. And the modern reader of Daniel 8 sees the little horn attacking the sacrifice, desecrating the temple, casting down truth. And so Daniel looks for the counter-offensive, or the vindication of God's people, or the restoration of the sacred temple services. During the Jewish calendar year, there would have been thousands of sacrifices made in the temple. The daily sacrifice for the sins of the people, sins that were committed unwittingly or without realizing it, and sacrifices for known sin and actions purposely committed against another. The accumulation of these confessed sins and the blood sprinkled in the temple climaxes on the day of Yom Kippur. The high priest enters the most holy place to offer the blood of the chosen lamb, symbolizing the blood of Christ offered for our sins. The camp waits in silence, listening for the tinkle of the bells on the high priest's garment. It's an indication that he's alive and that the offered sacrifice has been accepted as an atonement for their sins. Finally, he emerges with a shout of triumph and with a bowl of the cleansed blood from the temple. That represents the removal of sin from the most holy place. The camp, crowded with people, erupts in celebration that the judgment has been made to confirm that the sacrificial blood has redeemed them and ratified them as God's sealed people. How much they want to hear that judgment, how much they look forward to the cleansing and the shout of acceptance and redemption. There is a distinct link on Yom Kippur of both aspects of God's character, judge and creator. And it comes through the traditional Jewish writings and from the links of Yom Kippur on a Sabbath, and from the cleansing of creation as in the new earth. God is seen both as the God of judgment and the creator God, the Redeemer, in the same ceremony. Then the scapegoat is brought out, and the guilt is placed on the head in the final act of judgment that cleanses the temple from sin. It clears the whole camp from the guilt and burden of sin. But the second goat is not sacrificed. Its life is not an atonement for sin. It carries the consequence of sin, which is eternal separation from God. And eventually the consequences of sin, death, disease, sickness and pain will also be removed from his people, from his earth, and from his universe. The imagery is one of covering for sin by the blood of the Lamb, or the alternative, death by separating ourselves from God. So Daniel wants to know, when will this happen for all of humanity? How much longer can God's people wait? How soon will the high priest stand up and declare that it's time to deal with sin forever? Mankind's opportunity for forgiveness and cleansing is coming to an end. Now is the time for us to decide if we are covered or if we are separated. And the angel says, unto 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Daniel can see that this vision is only to be finished many days into the future, and he's not given a starting point yet for the 2,300 years, so he has no hope of an ending point. He does have a hope of an event and a judgment, but no time frame yet for this event. But for us, we live at the other end of the vision. We know the times and the starting date, and this will become evident in the next chapter and is fulfilled almost 100 years after Daniel. But now, more than 2,300 years later, we are at the time of the end. The high priest has declared that the sacrifice of Christ has covered our sins, and the final dealing with the contamination of sin has begun. Yes, truth has been trampled down, but truth has also been restored, and salvation is ours for the taking. Yes, the daily sacrifice has been taken away, but the blood of Christ atones for all, sacrificed once for all sin, and able to redeem all who choose him. Yes, the sanctuary was cast down, but has now been cleansed, and the high priest has moved from the holy place to prepare for the final act of judgment. Sin will be removed from all creation, and the earth will be cleansed. And the Creator God, who redeemed his people, will also restore the earth to its original state. That's what John saw in Revelation, that there will be a new heaven and a new earth. Revelation 21 verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the former heaven and the former earth had passed away. And in verse 5, and he who is seated on the throne said, See, I will make all things new. So where do you stand in all of this chaos? The setting, location, and events surrounding Daniel and his friends in Babylon challenge them as much as do the events surrounding us today. Daniel's focus was turned to the issue of worship, where God's truth had been defiled and polluted, to God's sacrifice, which had been belittled and scorned, where the true Creator God had been dishonoured and ignored. And Daniel's response can be ours too. To uphold the purity of truth, to accept, claim and live as if the sacrifice of Christ matters, to honour the Creator God in worship that reflects both spirit and truth, that is our call. Mandates won't stop this. Masks won't muzzle you. Social distancing won't separate you. And a cathedral or a church building may not be required. We can worship in spirit and truth by the rivers of Babylon or by the mighty Waikato, regardless. And so, let's remain connected to our communities as a witness of Christ's redemptive plan and his soon return.
Thank you for joining us this morning for our online service. I hope you were blessed by that message from Alan. He'll be with us again next week as we look at Daniel chapter 9. And so we've only got a couple of weeks left to go in the series. I don't know where the time's gone, but it's just flown by. But may you just be blessed this week. Remember, just keep your eyes on Jesus in these complicated times that we are living in. And we'll see you next time. Ka kite anō.